Welcome to this final lecture of the President's Symposium on the Gospel and Cultural Engagement. We have had an amazingly rich and provocative 2 days, and an exhausting 2 days for Bishop Tom. Let me say that for some of you who missed any of the 4 main sessions, there's a yellow form, I believe, out in the foyer, which you can order a CD of the 4 events, audio and visual recordings, if you would like to get those. Bishop Tom does not like long and elaborate, and if you will, fluffy introductions. So I will not introduce him. I will simply thank him. I will thank him for his profound impact on the church and on the world. Bishop Wright calls us beyond our sloppy thinking about Jesus and Christian faith to a careful and thoughtful understanding of Jesus and the Christian faith. He calls all Christians to the vocation of articulating an epistemology of love to our world. Bishop Tom is a marvelous example of the Christian scholar who seeks to do his scholarship in service of the church. And I believe it is essential that we follow his example of bringing careful, intelligent thinking to our life of discipleship, the work of the church, and the engagement of our culture. It is for this careful work of head and heart that I am very thankful for Bishop Wright. Tom.
Thank you very much, Les, and let me say one more time how grateful I and my wife both are for the wonderful welcome and hospitality we have received. It's been terrific to be here these last few days. The weather has been a revelation. I didn't know it would be like this, but I have been much more impressed by the revelation of the real interest, indeed passion, that has been shown for some very serious and intricate and, I hope, worthwhile topics by a wide range from this community, both from this university and from friends from further around. So thank you all very much for being here and for supporting this occasion, and to those who've worked extremely hard behind the scenes to scurry around and make everything happen. My topic for this evening is God, 9/11, the tsunami, and the new problem of evil. It's a serious topic. In the new heaven and the new earth, according to Revelation 21, there will be no more sea. Many people feel disappointed by this. The sea is a perennial delight, at least for those who don't have to make a living on it, and for those who don't have to be on the wrong beach at the wrong time. What's that all about? The sea is part of the original good creation. But already by the story of Noah, the flood poses a threat to the creation, with Noah and his floating zoo rescued by God's grace. From within the good creation itself come forces of chaos, harnessed, it seems, to enact God's judgment. We then find Moses and the Israelites standing in front of the sea, chased by the Egyptians and at their wits' end. God makes a way through the sea to rescue his people and again to judge the pagan world, like the Noah story, only now in a different mode. As later poets looked back on this decisive moment in the story of God's people, they celebrated it in terms of the old creation myths themselves. The waters saw Yahweh and were afraid, and they went backwards. But then, in a passage of enormous influence on early Christianity, we find in the vision of Daniel chapter 7 that the monsters who make war upon the people of the saints of the Most High come up out of the sea. The sea has become the dark, fearsome, threatening place from which evil emerges, threatening God's people like a giant tidal wave that threatens those who live near the coast. For the people of ancient Israel, who were not for the most part seafarers, the sea came to represent evil and chaos, the dark powers that might do to God's people what the flood had done to the whole world unless God were to rescue them as he rescued Noah. That sets the biblical context for any reflection on what happened on December the 26th last year. It may be indeed that one of the reasons we love the sea normally is because, like watching a horror movie, we can observe its power and relentless energy from a safe distance. Or if we choose to go sailing and swimming on it, we hope to be able to use its energy without being engulfed by it. I suspect there are plenty of PhD theses currently being written on what's going on psychologically when we do this sort of thing, and I haven't read any of them. We would, of course, though, find our delight turning to horror if, as we stood watching the waves roll in, a tsunami was suddenly to appear. Just as our thrill at watching a gangster movie would turn to screaming panic if a couple of thugs armed to the teeth came out of the screen and threatened us personally as we sat in the movie theater. The sea and the movie, seen from a safe distance, can be a way of saying to ourselves that, okay, evil may well exist, there may well be chaos out there somewhere, but at least, thank goodness, we're all right, we're not immediately threatened by it. And perhaps this is also saying that evil might just exist inside us as well. There may be forces of chaos deep inside us, of which we are at best only subliminally aware, but they're in control. The sea wall will hold. The cops will get the gangsters before they get us. Of course, in the movies of the last decade or two, things haven't always worked out like that, which may tell us something about how now, in postmodernity, we perceive evil both in the world and in ourselves. And of course, when a real tsunami wipes out 250,000 people in a day, we are forced to take stock of everything in a new way. We are forced, in fact, to think in fresh ways about the problem of evil. Maybe even to see that there is what I've called in tonight's title, a new problem of evil. What do I mean by this? In the last few years, everyone's been talking about evil in quite a new way. Your president declared that there is an axis of evil out there somewhere, and that we have to find the evil people and prevent them from doing any more evil. My Prime Minister, Tony Blair, said 3 years ago ambitiously that the aim of his government must be nothing short of ridding the world of evil. Actually, he's having a hard time doing it even in his own backyard. The press, certainly in my country, shout evil at the faces of terrorists and child murderers. They love talking about evil. And the odd thing about this new concentration on evil is that it seems to have taken many people, not least politicians and the media, by surprise. Of course, they would say that there has always been evil, but it seems to have come home to the Western world in a new way. The older discussions of evil and the problem it posed tended to be more abstract, with so-called natural evil, the tidal waves, and so-called moral evil, the gangsters. But the tsunami and the gangsters came out of the theory and attacked, just as in the previous generation, Auschwitz posed the problem in a new way. So September the 11th, 2001, kick-started a fresh wave of discussion about what evil is, where it comes from, how to understand it, what it does to your worldview, whether you're a Christian or an atheist or anything else, and not least, what on earth can be done about it. And though terrorism and tsunamis are not the same kind of thing, the events of December the 26th last year have added their own dimension to the problem. From the Christian point of view, there will be, in that sense, no more sea in the new heavens and the new earth. We are committed, with the worldview generated by the gospel of Jesus, to affirming that evil in all its forms will finally be conquered and eradicated, will be done away. But understanding why it's still there as it is, and how God has dealt with it and will deal with it, and how the cross of Jesus has anything to do with that, and how it affects us here and now, what we can do to be part of God's victory over evil. All these are deep mysteries which the sudden flurry of new interest in evil opens up as questions. And what I want to do this evening is not to try to answer all the questions and tick a bunch of boxes so we can all go home having got it sussed. You can't actually do that. But at least to sketch out the areas where we ought to be urgently thinking and praying. Now, the older ways of talking about evil tended to pose the puzzle as a metaphysical or theological conundrum. If there's a God, and if he's a good and wise and powerful God, why is there such a thing as evil? Even if you're an atheist, you face the problem, is this world a sick joke, which just contains some things that make us think it's a wonderful place, and other things which make us think it's an awful place? Or what is it? You could in fact call it the problem of good rather than the problem of evil. If the world is the chance assembly of accidental phenomena, why is there so much that we want to praise and celebrate? Why is there beauty and laughter and love? The problem of evil in its present metaphysical form has been around for at least 2.5 centuries. On All Saints' Day, November the 1st, 1755, a massive earthquake struck Lisbon, the capital of Portugal, and the earthquake produced a tidal wave, and because people had run down to the harbour to get away from falling buildings, the tidal wave then came back and did to them what tidal waves did on December the 26th last year. That caused a massive upheaval in European thought, which had previously taken it for granted for some little while. If you know anything about the early 18th century, you'll know this. Took it for granted that you could more or less read off many of the purposes and goodnesses of God from the natural order. And suddenly this happened on a saint's day when the churches were full. So all sorts of people got killed by that. And the wrestlings of the great Enlightenment thinkers, Voltaire, Rousseau, Kant, Hegel, and others, can be understood from one point of view as ways of trying to cope with that problem. And when we come further forward to Marx and Nietzsche, and then to the 20th century thinkers, not least the Jewish thinkers who have wrestled with the question of the Holocaust, we find a continuous thread of philosophical attempts to say what has to be said about the world and about evil within it. Unfortunately, one of the great lines which has emerged from this is the theory of progress. Everything is moving towards a better and fuller and more perfect end. And if there has to be some suffering on the way, well, that's okay because omelets are made from broken eggs. This belief in progress, which you find in poets like Keats, was in the air in the pantheism of the Romantic movement in the early 19th century, and was given an enormous boost by Charles Darwin's ideas and their application to fields considerably more diverse than birds and mammals. So the heady combination of technological advance, medical advance, romantic pantheism, increased democracy, Hegelian progressive idealism, and social Darwinism, all of this created a climate in which, to this day, a great many people, not least in public life, have lived and moved and still do. People really do believe that the world is improving. It's an article of faith. Things are getting better. Evil is on the decline. Progress is winning. A little bit more democracy, a little bit more westernization, a little bit more progress, and we'll have got evil sussed. We'll have got the problem cracked. Now, this belief in progress has received several quite severe challenges, but has remarkably survived and still flourishes. The First World War shook the old 19th century liberalism to its foundations, but then it somehow recovered. Auschwitz, the Holocaust, and Hiroshima, the atom bomb, shattered the idea of Western civilization as a place of nobility and virtue and humanizing reason. But people still seem to suppose that the world is basically a good place and that its problems are more or less soluble by more of the same, more technology, more education, more development in the sense of westernization, and the application or imposition of Western-style democracy and capitalism. That's what we still, as a society, like to think and believe. And this state of affairs has led to three things in particular which I see as characterizing the new problem of evil. First, we ignore evil when it doesn't actually come and hit us in the face. You can see this in the philosophy, psychology, and politics of the last century, but you don't need to look that far back. Western politicians knew perfectly well that Al-Qaeda was a serious danger, but nobody actually took it too seriously enough to do some proper checking out, until it was too late. Countries bordering on the Indian Ocean knew about tsunamis, but they hadn't bothered to install early warning systems. We all know today that third world debt is a massive running sore on the conscience of the world. But our politicians don't want to take it too seriously, because from our point of view, the world is progressing reasonably well, and we don't want to rock the economic boat or to upset powerful interests. We all know that sexual licentiousness creates massive unhappiness in families and individual lives, but we live in the 21st century, don't we? We don't want to go around saying that adultery is actually wrong. We live in a world where politicians and media pundits and economists and even, alas, some late-blooming liberal theologians speak as if humankind is basically all right. The world is basically all right, and there's nothing too much to make a fuss about. So first, we ignore evil, except when it hits us in the face. And then second, we are very surprised when it does. We in England liked to think of English small towns as pleasant, safe places. And 3 years ago, we were shocked to the core, and still are, when in a small town called Soham near Cambridge, 2 little girls were murdered by somebody who they'd obviously trusted and known. We just don't have categories to cope with that. But nor do we have categories to cope with the larger renewed evils, such as renewed tribalism and genocide in Africa. We like to fool ourselves that the world is basically all right, now that so many countries have at least some vestiges of democracy, now that globalization has, at least in theory, enabled us to do so much, to profit so much, to know so much. And then we're puzzled as well as shocked by the human tidal wave, the human tsunami, the great, enormous sea of refugees and asylum seekers that washes up on our shores, saying, "It's terrible out there, please can you help?" Likewise, terrorism itself takes us by surprise, since we're used to imagining and telling ourselves that all decent people are going to discuss questions round the table, and we then get puzzled that some people still think that doesn't work and they need to use more drastic methods of getting their point across. And ultimately we are, of course, shocked again and again by the fact of death. We kind of ruled it out of the equation, and when it comes back and hits us, we're not ready for it. We ignore evil for the most part, and then we're shocked when it comes and hits us in the face. And so thirdly, as a result, this is where the shoe really pinches, of course, we react in immature and dangerous ways. The reaction in the Western world, your country and mine, to the events of September the 11th has been a knee-jerk, unthinking, immature lashing out. Don't misunderstand me. The terrorist actions of Al-Qaeda were and are unmitigatedly evil. But the astonishing naivety, which said that we in the West were pure, innocent victims, so that the world could be neatly divided up into evil people, those people out there, and good people, people like us, and that we then had a responsibility to punish them, and that this justified those wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, that's a large-scale example of what I'm talking about. Just as it is immature and naive to suggest the mirror image of this view, namely that the Western world is guilty in all respects and that all protesters and terrorists are therefore justified in what they do. You meet that too from time to time. I met the same immature reactions after the tsunami. I was in another part of the United States in early January this year, and I met the view, to my horror, that since most of the countries where the tsunami struck were places where people are Muslims or Hindus or Buddhists, this made a certain point that God was trying to tell them something. And I then heard that on the Al Jazeera Arabic radio station, somebody was saying that most of the people killed in the tsunami were those hedonistic Western tourists. So obviously God was trying to tell them something. The immature lashing out because we're not used to dealing with radical evil. So the Western world has not been able to cope with evil from within its basically modernist beliefs. Postmodernity doesn't help here, because postmodernity does highlight the problem of evil remorselessly, but it doesn't return to a classic doctrine of original sin, because through deconstruction it denies that there's anybody really there responsible in the first place. Humans deconstruct, look in the mirror, and all you get is a sea of shifting signifiers and impulses and so on. There is no I any longer, no one to take responsibility. There is no moral dignity left. To shoulder responsibility is the last virtue left open to those who've forsworn all other kinds, and to have even that disallowed is to reduce human beings to mere ciphers. And most of us, not least the genuine victims of crime and abuse, find that both counterintuitive and disgusting. Furthermore, postmodernity's analysis of evil allows for no redemption. There is no way out, no chance of repentance and restoration, no way back to solid moral ground from the quicksands of deconstruction. Postmodernity is correct to say that evil is real and powerful and important, but it gives us no clue as to what to do about it, except possibly to escape into the nearest virtual reality machine while you still can. It is therefore vital that we look elsewhere and broaden the categories of the problem from the shallow modernist puzzles on the one hand and the nihilistic deconstructive analyses on the other, and sends us back, as you would expect me to go back, to the Bible itself. Now, 3 things to say by way of introduction to a brief sketch of a biblical response. First, there are no easy answers in Scripture or elsewhere. If you think you've solved the problem of evil, that just shows you haven't understood it. You cannot say, there's a dreadful hymn that says, "Then shall we know, they that love him, how all their pain is good." That borders on the blasphemy. It offers a moral chaos worse than that offered by Job's comforters. No, you don't say that pain is good, any more than you say that death is good. Let's not connive with the enemy here. Nor can we say that evil is sort of good after all, because it provides a context for moral effort and even heroism, as though you could get God off the hook by making the world a theatre where God sets up little plays to give his characters a chance to show how virtuous they really are. That is trivializing to the point of blasphemy too. So first, no easy answers. Second, the line between good and evil. As Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, Solzhenitsyn returned to the Soviet Union after all his years of exile. And as he went through, he went on a great journey from east to west through old Russia. And as he stopped at place after place, he would talk to local officials and people who were around the place. And people would say to him, "You shouldn't be talking to those people. They were the officials under communism. They're wicked people." And he said, "You just can't do that. This isn't a game of us and them." He said, "The line between good and evil runs through every single one of us, through every single human community. It's not between the West and the rest, between left and right, between rich and poor. No, it runs through the middle of us. That is not to say that all humans and all societies are equally good or equally bad. Far from it. Merely that we are all infected, and that all attempts to see the problem in terms of us and them are deeply flawed. And third introductory point, though there is indeed a difference in kind between the problem posed by 9/11 and the problem posed by the tsunami, there were no terrorists or wicked governments to blame for the tsunami. A tectonic plate has got to do what a tectonic plate has got to do. Both of them pose together the great question to which, in a measure, the Bible is written to address, even though we can't fully understand the answers. So, going back to the Bible, famous phrase, we've already seen that the sea, both in itself and in its symbolic significance, is simultaneously part of God's good creation and part of the continuing source of chaos and terror. We should also note, to glance ahead to the very end of the story, that God declares throughout Scripture that he is going to put the world to rights at last, even though this will involve, in the phrase of the prophet Haggai, giving both heaven and earth one last great shake to sort everything out. Scripture seems to be saying to us that creation is good but incomplete, and that human evil has somehow stalled the project of creation in its incomplete mode, so that humans need to be put right and the world itself needs a good shake. And the biblical imagery of judgment insists over and over again that God's going to do that and thereby put the world to rights and wipe away every tear from every eye. But how is this to come about? Here I believe we've gone astray. We have been accustomed to seeing what we call the problem of evil in terms simply of the philosophical problem of how to justify a good, wise, and powerful God in the face of continuing evil. We've therefore gone to the book of Job, as well we might, as the one part of Scripture which addresses the problem in more or less those terms. But we've failed to see that the whole of Scripture addresses the problem of evil in quite a different way. After Noah and his flood comes the Tower of Babel. And immediately after that, God calls Abraham and declares that through him all the families of the earth will be blessed. The curse of evil at every level is to be undone. Those Israelite prophets and poets who saw this most clearly spoke of creation healed, of the wolf and the lamb lying down together, of swords being beaten into plowshares, of shrubs and fruit trees coming up to replace the thorns and thistles and briars that had defaced the garden. And they spoke of evil in a variety of ways. They spoke of evil in terms of wicked nations that oppressed God's people, of wicked rulers who oppressed the poor in their own country, of wicked people within society using their money or their power to oppress one another. They spoke of evil in terms of the failure of human beings in general, and of Israel in particular, to live as God's image-bearing creatures, to live as God's redeemed people, as Israel were. They spoke, in other words, of evil right the way through in individuals and in society, of evil as a problem infecting all, including God's people, of evil in terms both of human wickedness and of demonic activity, of structural injustice and systematic oppression, particularly in the world's great empires, and of evil rumbling along, not least in the chaotic sea itself. The opening chapters of Genesis make all this very clear. But then in Abraham, God declares as an act of sovereign grace that a new way has opened up, a way by which the original purpose of blessing for humankind and the creation can be taken forward. And from within the story, we already know that this is going to be hugely costly for God himself. The loneliness of God looking for his partners, Adam and Eve, in the garden. The grief of God before the flood, as he says, it grieved him to its heart. The head-shaking exasperation of God at Babel. The frustration of God at Abraham's vacillating half-obedience. All these God knows God will have to continue to put up with. There will be numerous further acts of judgment as well as mercy as the story unfolds, but unfold it will. The overarching picture is that of the sovereign creator God who will continue to work within the world. That's the key. Until blessing replaces curse, homecoming replaces exile, olive branches appear after the flood, and a new family is created in which the scattered languages can be reunited. That is the narrative which forms the outer frame for the canonical Old Testament. It is not a matter, as in many philosophical puzzles, of God as the puppet master, pulling the strings from a long way away. It's a matter of God loving his world so much that when faced with evil within it, he will work precisely within it, despite all the horrible ambiguities that will result. That is a summary, actually, of Old Testament theology. Because the body of the Old Testament from this point onwards carries, and the writers know it carries, the deeply ambiguous story of how Abraham's family, the people through whom God's solution was being taken forwards, was composed of people who were themselves part of the problem. The Exodus gives the major paradigmatic Jewish answer to the question, what is God doing with evil? Evil is here in the form of this wicked Egyptian empire that has enslaved and is oppressing the Israelites. Classic situation. But then when the people are freed, they behave themselves in a thoroughly pagan manner. As has often been said, it was easy to take Israel out of Egypt. It's much harder to take Egypt out of Israel. They continue to behave in a pagan fashion in the deeply ambiguous entry into the land and in the period of the judges and in the monarchy. David, the man after God's own heart, is himself deeply flawed. And exile threatens and looms. And then, like a great tsunami, Babylon comes and sweeps away the nation, the city, the temple where Yahweh himself had lived in the midst of the people. And though the people return 2 generations later, all is still not well. Pagan empires still lord it over them. And in Daniel's phrase, the monsters come up out of the sea to attack. And God's people still cry to Yahweh to come and redeem them, to put everything right once and for all. And at the heart of the greatest prophetic book of all, that of Isaiah, we find the picture of Yahweh's servant, who does two things at once. He represents Israel in the purposes of God, God's rescue operation, and he also embodies God himself for Israel and the world. And it is immediately after his suffering and death in Isaiah 53 that we have the word of new covenant in chapter 54 and of new creation in chapter 55, the healing of God's people and God's world because of the work of the servant. Somehow the prophet is saying the people of Israel, the bearers of the solution, have themselves become part of the problem, but just as God had determined to work from within to rescue the world, so by calling Israel, he has determined to work from within Israel to rescue Israel. By calling this royal yet suffering figure, by equipping him with his own spirit, and by allowing the worst that evil can do to fall upon him. If you want to understand God's justice in an unjust world, says Isaiah, this is where you must look. God's justice is a saving, healing, restorative justice, because the God to whom justice belongs is the Creator God who has yet to complete his original plan for creation, and whose justice is not simply designed to solve a philosophical puzzle, for goodness sake, nor is it simply designed just to restore the balance to a world that's got out of kilter. It is designed to bring to glorious completion and fruition the creation teeming with life and possibility that he made in the first place. Somehow Isaiah has so redefined the broader picture of evil, of the injustice of the world and the justice of the Creator God, that we now see it not as a philosopher's puzzle requiring explanation, but as the tragedy of all creation requiring a fresh act from the sovereign Creator God, focused on the tragedy of Israel requiring a fresh act from the sovereign covenant God. And to our amazement and our horror, we see this fresh act coming into sharp focus in the suffering and death of the servant, sharing the fate of Israel in exile, the exile which we know from Genesis 3 onwards is closely aligned with death itself. He bears the sin of the many. He embodies the covenant faithfulness, the restorative justice of the sovereign God. And with his stripes, says the prophet, we are healed. Central to the Old Testament's picture of God's justice in an unjust world, then, is the picture of God's faithfulness to unfaithful Israel. And central to that picture is the picture of Yahweh's servant, an individual who stands over against Israel and takes Israel's fate upon himself, so that Israel may be rescued from exile and the human race proceed at last towards the new creation, where thorns and thistles are replaced by cypress and myrtle, where dust and death are replaced by new life, where the chaos of the sea is replaced with the victory of the Creator. Within the larger canonical context, we might see the entire book of Job alongside Isaiah as an anticipation of that harrowing scene in Gethsemane, another garden where God felt strangely alone, where the comforters again fail, and even creation goes dark as the monsters close in around the innocent figure who asks the question we all ask, what's it all about? And that leads me to the heart of this lecture, the moment when the sinfulness of humankind grieved God to his heart, the moment when the servant was despised and rejected, the moment when Job asked God why it had to be that way. They all rushed together when the Son of Man knelt lonely and afraid before going to face the might of the beasts that had come up out of the sea. The story of Gethsemane and of the cross itself present themselves in the New Testament as the strange, dark conclusion to the story of what God does about evil, of what happens to God's justice when it takes human flesh, when it gets its feet muddy in the garden and its hands bloody on the cross. The multiple ambiguities of God's actions in the world come together in the story of Jesus. Now, theologies of the cross, of atonement, have not, in my view, grappled sufficiently with the larger problem of evil as normally conceived. Conversely, those who've written about the problem of evil within philosophical theology have not normally grappled sufficiently with the cross of Jesus, both as the analysis and as the solution of that problem. The two have been held apart in a mismatch, with the problem of evil being conceived on the one hand simply in terms of how could a good and powerful God allow evil into his world in the first place, and the atonement on the other hand being seen simply in terms of personal forgiveness, of me and God getting it back together again. Much modern Christian thought has accepted the framework offered by the Enlightenment, in which the Christian faith rescues people from the evil world, assuring them of forgiveness here and hereafter, and the Enlightenment-based wider world has then accepted that evaluation of the Christian faith, not surprising since it was driving it in the first place. And so it has not thought it necessary to factor in Christian theology to its own discussions of the problem of evil. You could sharpen it like this: how does a hymn like "There is a Green Hill Far Away" have anything to say to a world dumbstruck in horror at the First World War, at Auschwitz, at Hiroshima, at 9/11? Does it really help those questions to say, I'm all right, I'm going to be forgiven, I'm going to go to heaven? With this in mind, we need to read the Gospels as what they are. People often observe that, surprisingly, there isn't much of what seems like atonement theology in the Gospels. Mark's theology of the cross often seems to be reduced to one key verse, chapter 10, verse 45. The Son of Man came to give his life a ransom for many, as though Mark has just dropped in this little bit of atonement theology into a narrative which is otherwise simply a description of what happened. The Lord's Supper gives a few hints towards an atonement theology. The crucifixion narratives provide some further elements, but for the most part, the Gospels, as read within the mainstream tradition of both scholarship and church life, simply give a general narrative about how Jesus got himself killed as a backcloth to an atonement theology which is grounded elsewhere in Paul or Hebrews or 1 Peter. But if we read the Gospels in a more holistic fashion, I wonder if you do that. I wonder if you've ever actually sat down and read Mark through from beginning to end. I say Mark because it's the shortest. If you read at an ordinary pace, it'll probably take you about 50 minutes. Why not? Instead of just reading a chapter or just 10 verses at a time, just say, right, I'm going to sit down this afternoon and read Matthew or John. Probably blow your socks off, no bad thing. If you read the Gospels in a more holistic fashion, you find that they tell a double story, drawing together the themes I've spoken of so far. They tell the story of how the evil in the world, political, social, personal, moral, emotional, demonic, reached its height. It's there all through the Gospels. And they tell the story of how God's long-term plan for Israel, and if we can put it like this, God's long-term plan for himself, finally came to their climax. And they tell these stories in and as the story of how Jesus of Nazareth announced God's kingdom and went to his violent death. They are about atonement with every line. They are about the problem of evil with every paragraph. They are about evil of all sorts, converging like a dark storm cloud, and about God's representative Messiah, going to the heart of that storm cloud alone. The Gospels read in this way offer us both a richer theology of atonement than we are used to, and also a much deeper understanding of the problem of evil itself and what can and must be done about it in our own day. The Gospels have more to say about terrorism and tsunamis than we might imagine. Watch as they tell how all the varied forces of evil are involved in putting Jesus on the cross. They tell how the political powers of the world reached their full arrogant height. Rome and Herod are there in the background throughout the Gospels, as is Caiaphas with his corrupt Jerusalem regime, and all three come into focus as we get closer to the cross. So too the Gospels tell the story of corruption and rebellion within Israel itself. The Pharisees have offered a hard-edged interpretation of Torah which excludes Jesus' theory that God's kingdom is breaking in then and there with him. The revolutionaries, the violent ones, try to get in on the act of God's inbreaking kingdom, but they, the terrorists of their day, try to fight violence with violence and so merely collude with the real problem of evil. The death of Jesus, when it comes, is the work not only of the pagan nations, but of all these forces that have swirled around, not least of the Israel that has reduced itself to saying that it has no king but Caesar. The Gospels also tell the story in terms of the deeper, darker, demonic forces which operate at a suprapersonal level. These forces operate through all the human elements I've mentioned, but they can't be reduced to terms of them. The shrieking demons that yell at Jesus, that rush at him out of the tombs, are signs that a battle has been joined at a more than personal level. The stormy sea and the Sea of Galilee, the miniature but deadly tsunamis that can blow up on that sea, evoke ancient Israelite imagery of an evil which is more than the sum total of present wrongdoing and woe. And there is Jesus asleep in the boat as the storm gets to its height. Think about it. The power of darkness Jesus alludes to immediately before his betrayal in the garden suggests that on that night evil was being given free rein to do its worst, with the soldiers and the betrayer and the muddled disciples and the corrupt court as its mere instruments. The mocking bystanders as Jesus hangs on the cross, "If you are the Son of God," echo the taunting, tempting voice that had whispered in the desert. And the power of death itself, the ultimate denial of the goodness of creation, speaks of a force of destruction, of anti-world, anti-God power being allowed to do its worst. And the Gospels tell this whole story in order to say that the tortured young Jewish prophet hanging on the cross was the point where evil, including the violence of terror and the non-human forces at work in the sea and all creation, had become truly and fully and totally itself. The Gospels tell the story of the downward spiral of evil. One thing leads to another. The remedy offered against evil has itself the germ of evil within it, so that attempts by the disciples to put things right, Peter flailing around with his sword in the garden, merely produces second-order evil, and so on and so on. Judas's betrayal and Peter's denial are simply among the last twists of this story, with the casual injustice of Caiaphas and Pilate and the mocking of the crowds at the cross tying the loose ends together. Once we learn to read the Gospels in this holistic fashion, we hear them telling us that the death of Jesus is the result both of the major political evil of the world, the power games which the world was playing, as it still does, and of the dark accusing forces, satanic forces if you like, which stand behind those human and societal structures, forces which accuse creation itself of being evil and so try to destroy it while its creator is longing to redeem it. The Gospels tell the story of Jesus' death as the story of how this downward spiral of evil finally hit the bottom with the violent and bloody execution of this man, this prophet, who had announced God's kingdom. The Gospels thus tell the story, and there's no time to go into any of the detail that one could, of the story of Jesus and particularly of his death as the story of how cosmic and global evil, in its suprapersonal as well as personal forms, are met by the sovereign, saving love of Israel's God, Yahweh, the creator of the world. The Gospel writers write intentionally to draw the whole story of the Old Testament to its climax, seeing that narrative precisely as the story of God's strange and dark solution to the problem of evil from Genesis 3 onwards. What the Gospels offer is not a philosophical explanation of evil. What good would that do to us? What it is or why it's there. Rather, the story of an event in which the living God, who has always desired to work from within his wounded world, finally does so and deals with evil. like the Exodus from Egypt or the return from Babylon, only now with fully cosmic reach. God has rescued his people from the dark powers of chaos. The sea monsters have done their worst, and God has vindicated his people, and in Easter has put creation to rights. And he's done so through the suffering of Israel's representative, the Messiah. This is what it looks like when Yahweh says, as he does in Exodus 4, I've heard the cry of my people, and I've come to set them free. This is what it looks like when Yahweh says in Isaiah 42, behold my servant. As Isaiah says later in chapter 59, it was no messenger, no angel, it was his own presence that saved them. And in all their affliction he was afflicted. God chose the appropriate and necessarily ambiguous route of acting from within his creation, from within his chosen people, to take the full force of evil upon himself and so to exhaust it. And the result is that the covenant is renewed, that sins are forgiven, that the long night of sorrow, exile, and death is over, and the new day has dawned. New creation has begun, the new world in which violence itself will be overcome, and yes, the sea will be no more. The Gospels thus tell the story which is unique in the world's great literature, religious theories or philosophies, the story of the Creator God taking responsibility for what's happened to creation, bearing the weight of his problems on his own shoulders. As Sidney Carter, who's most famous for writing The Lord of the Dance, put it in one of, to my mind, his finest songs, it's God they ought to crucify instead of you and me, I said to the carpenter, a hanging on the tree. Or as one old evangelistic tract put it, the nations of the world got together to pronounce sentence on God for all the evils in the world, only to realize with a shock that God had already served his sentence. The tidal wave of evil had crashed over the head of God himself. The terrorist spear went into his side like a plane crashing into a great building. God has been there. He has taken the weight of the world's evil on his own shoulders. This is not an explanation. It's not a philosophical conclusion. It is an event. And as we gaze on in horror, we may perhaps glimpse God's presence in the deep darkness of our world, God's strange, unlooked-for victory over the evil of our world. And then, and only then, we may glimpse also God's vocation to us to work with him on the new solution to the new problem of evil. I spoke earlier of the shallow analysis of evil and of the immature reactions which it produces. It's fascinating that the best known of the gospel atonement passages occurs in the context of a sharp saying of Jesus about the nature of political power and the subversion of normal political power by those gospel events themselves. This is the beginning of the end of this lecture, talking about implementing now what was done on the cross. James and John come to Jesus with a request, Mark 10:35. We want to sit on either side of you, at your right and your left, when you come in your kingly power. That is a political question which receives a political answer, namely, earthly rulers lord it over their subjects, their great ones exercise dominion over them, but it's not going to be like that with you. Rather, those who are great must be the servants, and those who are chief must be slave of all, because the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. That evocation of Isaiah 53, in a manner entirely true to the original context, sits in the middle of the political analysis of empire, subverting that empire, based as it is on violence, by showing how all the traditions of Israel, the people through whom God would address and solve the problem of the world's evil, converge on a figure who takes all that Babylon, all that Rome can do, and exhausts and defeats it. We find the same point in Luke chapter 9, where again James and John want to do things in the world's way. What do they want to do? These people are opposing us. This village hasn't received us. Let's call down fire from heaven on them. Jesus says, you don't know what you're talking about. a rebuke to them which is directly cognate with Father, forgive them, which is what he says on the cross. What then is the result? The call of the gospel is for the church now to implement in the world the victory which was won on Calvary. The cross is not just an example to be followed. It is an example to be followed, but it is an achievement to be worked out, put into practice. And as we do so, using the cross as example, we find it as the template, as the model for what God now wants to do by his Spirit in his world and through his people. It is the start of a different sort of process, not like the Hegelian progress where the world gets better and better, but step by step, as often unsung heroes and heroines go to the world with the love of God and the victory of the cross, in which suffering and martyrdom are the paradoxical means by which victory is won. The suffering love of God, lived out again by the Spirit in the lives of God's people, is the God-given answer to the evils of the world. Someone's going to ask, what if the people who now bear the solution become ourselves part of the problem, as happened before? Yes, that is a danger, and it must be addressed. I can't avoid it. The church is never more at risk than when it sees itself merely as the solution bearer and can get on our white horses and charge off to put the world to rights, as though we're now fine. No, we must never forget that every day we say, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. When Jesus taught us in the Lord's Prayer to say, forgive us our trespasses, he assumed we would need to say that again and again and again. We must allow that confession to work its way into genuine humility, even as we stand boldly before the world and its crazy empires. In particular, it is a problem. It is a well-known problem when a Christian empire seeks to impose its will dualistically on the world by labeling other parts of the world evil while seeing itself as the avenging army of God. We British used to do that. That is more or less exactly what Jesus saw in the Israel of his day and what he saw in James and John. The cross was and is a call to a different vocation, a new way of dealing with evil, ultimately a new vision of God. What, after all, would it look like if the true God came to deal with evil? Would he come in a blaze of glory, in a pillar of cloud and fire, surrounded by legions of angels, dealing out fire and brimstone on his enemies? Jesus of Nazareth took the total risk of speaking and acting as if the answer to the question, what would God look like coming to deal with evil, is this: that when the true God comes back to deal with evil, he will look like a young Jewish prophet riding into Jerusalem at Passover time, celebrating the kingdom, confronting the corrupt authorities, feasting with his friends, succumbing in prayer and agony to a cruel and unjust fate, taking upon himself the weight of Israel's sin, the world's sin, evil with a capital E. When we look at Jesus in this way, we find that the cross has become the new temple, the place where we go to meet the true God and hail him as our Savior and Redeemer. The cross becomes the place of pilgrimage, where we stand and gaze at what was done for each one of us. The cross becomes the sign by which and by which alone we then go to address and heal the wickedness of the world. The cross becomes the sign that pagan empire, symbolized in the might and power of sheer brutal force, has been decisively challenged by a different power, the power of love, and that this decisive challenge shall win the day. That is the Christian answer to the problems which are summed up for us in 9/11. What then about the tsunami? There is no straightforward answer, but there are small clues. We are not to suppose that the world as it currently is the way God intends it to be at the last. Some serious thinkers, including some contemporary physicists, would actually now link the convulsions which still happen in the world, even in tectonic plates, to evil that is perpetrated by humans. That's not now as fanciful as once it seemed. It is indeed fair enough to probe for deeper connections than modernist science imagined between human behavior and the total environment of our world. That's not my speciality. I really don't know how far-fetched that is, though I have heard it argued by some serious people. But I find it easier to suppose that the project of creation, the good world which God made at the beginning, was supposed to go forward under the wise stewardship of the human race, God's vicegerents, God's image bearers, and that when the human race turned to worship creation instead of God, the project could not proceed in the intended manner, but instead bore thorns and thistles, volcanoes and tsunamis, the terrifying wrath of the creation which we humans had treated as if it were a god. When we then go to the Gospels for help here, we should listen to what they actually say. Take Matthew. Matthew tells the story of the God with us, the Emmanuel, with us in the middle of the swirling, raging waters, asleep in the boat on the lake, vulnerable to the screams of the demoniacs and the plots of the Pharisees, undermined by his own associates, and finally hunted down by the chief priests and handed over to the imperial authorities. Matthew would forbid us to frame the question about the tsunami in terms of a God who sits upstairs and pulls puppet strings and we wonder why he does it this way and that. We can and must only tell the story in terms of the God who is with his people in the midst of the mighty waters, the God who was swept off his feet and out to sea, the God who lost his parents and family, the God who was crushed under falling concrete and buried in mud. And then we have to tell the story as well in terms of the God who rescued others while not saving himself, the God who worked night and day to recover others and help those who are still alive, the God who rushed to the scene with all the help he could muster, the God who gave not only generously but lavishly to help the relief effort. If we believe in Matthew's God, the Emmanuel, we must learn to see God in that way, and we must learn to embody God in that way. Remember that when Jesus died, the earth shook and the rocks were torn in pieces while the sky darkened at noon. God the Creator will not always save us from these dark forces, but he will save us in them, being with us in the darkness and promising us, always promising us, that the new creation which began at Easter will one day be complete, and that with that completion there will be full healing, full understanding, full justice, full reconciliation, full consolation. The thorns and the thistles will be replaced by the cypress and the myrtle. There will be no more sea. The Gospels then pose the question to us at every level. Questions about what we have called the atonement, as well as questions about what we have called the problem of evil. Dare we stand in front of the cross and admit that all that was done for us? Dare we take all the meanings of the word God and all the questions about God and allow them to be re-centered upon, redefined around this man, this moment, this death? Dare we take the chaos of the dark forces within our own selves and allow Jesus to rebuke them as he rebuked the winds and the waves on the Sea of Galilee? Dare we address the consequences of what Jesus himself said, that the rulers of this world behave in one way, but that we mustn't do it like that? Dare we thus put atonement theology and political theology together, with the deeply personal message on the one side and the utterly practical and political message on the other side, and turn away from the way of James and John, the way of calling down fire from heaven on our enemies, and embrace the way of Jesus himself? There we live out the message of God's restorative justice, claiming the victory of the cross not only over the obvious wickednesses of the world, but the wickednesses of those who want to fight fire with fire to bring a solution by creating further problems. And dare we stand at the foot of the cross, feeling the storm clouds darken overhead and the earth tremble beneath our feet, and pray once more for God to finish his new creation, to make the wolf and the lamb lie down together, to bid the mighty waves of the sea be still and depart for good, to establish the new heavens and new earth in which justice and joy will dwell forever. Evil is still a four-letter word. So, thank God, is love. God grant us grace to be so filled with that love that we may work in our day with mature, Christian, sober intelligence to address the problem of evil, to implement the victory achieved once for all on the cross, and to be agents and heralds and living embodiments of that new creation in which the earth shall be filled with the glory of God as the waters cover the sea. Amen.
Just amazing. What a wonderful time we have had over the last 2 years, last 2 days. I'm sure indeed to Tom it feels like two years. We have worked him hard. Somehow I believe this is what God's people ought to be doing. To gather together like this, to step back and reflect on our world. In the midst of our busyness and our confusion and our fear and our joys, to pause and to think about God's grand sweeping story of love and justice and peace and light. Somehow I think that's what a Christian university ought to be doing as well. I told Tom earlier that he models for us what our mission and vision is in this place. And he has done that so amazingly tonight. We thank you, Tom, for being with us, for your generous spirit, and for your wonderful intelligence, and for your persistent and consistent writing and thinking and reflecting on what it means to be a Christian in our world today. A hard-headed look at the world, and yet still this amazing story of God's love, this sweeping story that we can participate in. Thank you so much for being with us. And thank you all for joining us. Thank you to our members of our community, to students, faculty, and staff for gathering here, for those of you who are visitors joining us with this is what our university is all about. And we are glad you have been here with us. God bless you.